In the early 20th century, Chicago built homes faster than almost any city in America, yet still failed to house its people. This single fact sits at the heart of the city's long struggle with public housing. It raises a quiet question. How could a city so skilled at building railroads, factories, and towers fall behind on shelter? The answer unfolds slowly, and it begins long before public housing existed. Chicago did not begin with a housing crisis. It grew into one. At the turn of the century, the city was expanding at a speed few places had ever seen. People arrived every day. They came by train from the east. They came by ship through the Great Lakes. They came on foot from nearby towns. They came because Chicago promised work, and in those years, it delivered. The problem waiting just ahead was where all these people would sleep. By 1900, Chicago had more than 1.6 million residents. Factories spread along rivers and rail lines. Stockyards pulled workers to the south side. Steel mills rose near the lake. Housing followed jobs, but only just enough to keep people inside the city limits. Builders worked fast. Quality came second. Speed came first. This choice would matter later. Many families lived in tenements built close together. Rooms were small and dark. Windows were few. Air moved poorly. Whole families rented 1 or 2 rooms. Boarders shared beds in shifts. Children slept wherever space allowed. This was not rare. This was daily life for thousands of people. City leaders knew this. Reports described it. Newspapers printed stories. Still, little changed. Reformers spoke up early. Health officials warned that disease spread faster in crowded housing. Social workers linked poor shelter to poor schooling and crime. Jane Addams, working from Hull House, wrote clearly about how living conditions shaped behavior and health. She did not speak in abstract terms. She described what she saw. The city listened politely and moved slowly. While leaders debated, Chicago kept growing. Immigration reshaped whole neighborhoods. People from Eastern Europe settled near factories. Italians clustered near construction work. Irish and German families filled older districts. Each group took what housing it could afford. Landlords packed buildings full. Profit guided decisions more than safety. Inspectors existed, but enforcement was weak and uneven. Then another movement began, one that would leave a deep mark on Chicago's housing history. Between 1916 and 1930, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans moved north from the South. They came to escape violence and poverty. They came for factory jobs and railroad work. Chicago became one of their main destinations. The city offered wages. It did not offer welcome. Housing options were sharply limited. Racial barriers shaped where people could live. Some deeds banned sales to Black families. Many landlords refused them outright. Banks denied loans. Insurance costs rose. A narrow stretch of the South Side became the main area where Black families could find housing. This area grew crowded fast. It later became known as the Black Belt. As more people arrived, density increased. Rents rose. Conditions worsened. Buildings aged without repair. Wooden stairs weakened. Roofs leaked. Fire risk increased. Families stayed anyway because they had nowhere else to go. This was not hidden. City reports described it in detail. Photographs showed it plainly. Yet the city still relied on private markets to solve the problem. This belief held until the economy collapsed. The Great Depression changed the conversation. Jobs vanished. Wages disappeared. Rent went unpaid. Evictions increased. Homelessness spread. Private builders stopped building. Banks froze lending. The housing market failed in a way no one could ignore. For the first time, national leaders accepted that housing was a public concern. Federal programs followed. Relief agencies studied cities. Housing surveys gathered data. Chicago stood out for its size and need. Reformers pushed harder. They argued that clearing slums without replacing housing only deepened the crisis. Slowly, a new idea gained ground. Government could build homes. The United States Housing Act of 1937 marked a turning point. It allowed cities to create public housing authorities and use federal funds to build low-rent housing. Chicago moved quickly. The Chicago Housing Authority was formed. Its leaders spoke of safety, health, and order. They promised to replace slums with clean, modern homes. Yet from the start, fear shaped decisions. Leaders worried about voter backlash. They worried about neighborhood resistance. They worried about race. New housing sites were chosen near areas already marked as poor. Projects avoided white neighborhoods. Existing racial lines guided placement. This choice seemed practical at the time. Its consequences would last for generations. Early public housing developments opened before World War II. They replaced some of the worst slums. They offered indoor plumbing, light, and open space. For many residents, this felt like rescue. Children played in cleaner yards, mothers cooked in safer kitchens. These improvements mattered, and people noticed. Still, strict rules governed who could stay. Income limits applied. Families who earned more had to leave. Public housing was not designed as a permanent home or a step upward. It was a narrow solution to a wide problem. Pressure continued to build as demand outpaced supply. Then war arrived. World War II brought factories back to life. Workers poured into the city. Housing demand exploded again. Temporary units filled open land and parks. Speed mattered more than planning. When the war ended, shortages remained. Chicago faced a choice: expand public housing or allow the crisis to deepen. The pressure was immediate and unmistakable. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Chicago was already an industrial city. The war turned it into a production engine. Steel mills along the south side and near the Calumet River shifted to 24-hour schedules. Inland Steel, U.S. Steel Southworks, and Republic Steel expanded output to meet military demand. Factories produced armor plate, rail equipment, engines, and ammunition. Rail yards handled troop movements and supplies without pause. Chicago became essential to the war effort almost overnight. This expansion required labor, and labor arrived fast. Between 1941 and 1945, workers poured into the city from rural Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and the Deep South. Many Black Americans continued the Great Migration that had begun during World War I. Defense jobs offered steady wages and an escape from Southern segregation. White workers also came from small towns where wartime factories did not exist. The city absorbed tens of thousands of new residents in just a few years. Housing demand surged beyond anything planners had anticipated. Existing shortages worsened immediately. Families doubled up, boarders filled spare rooms, rents climbed. Overcrowding increased in neighborhoods already under strain. City officials understood that the problem could not be solved by private builders alone, since construction materials were rationed for the war. Temporary housing appeared as an emergency response. Beginning in 1942, federally funded war housing projects were built on vacant land, near factories, and on the edges of parks and rail corridors. These units were simple and functional. Many were prefabricated. Some were barrack-style buildings. They were labeled temporary from the start. Officials knew they would not last beyond the war years. They filled gaps, but they did not solve the problem. By 1943, the Chicago Housing Authority was under intense pressure. Applications for public housing increased sharply. Federal funding was available through wartime housing programs and earlier New Deal legislation, but these funds came with strict conditions. Projects had to remain low cost. They had to replace housing classified as substandard. Budgets were tightly controlled. Designs had to meet federal cost formulas. There was little room for experimentation. Land prices mattered more than design ideals. Empty land inside Chicago was scarce by the early 1940s. Clearing existing neighborhoods required compensation, relocation, and time. Each delay worsened shortages. The authority faced a clear constraint: build upward or build nowhere. Tall buildings began to appear practical not because they were proven, but because alternatives were limited. This is where the path narrowed. High-rise housing itself was not new to Chicago. The city had built tall residential buildings since the late 19th century. What was new was the decision to use high-rise towers for large numbers of low-income families supported entirely by public funds. This approach had not been tested on a wide scale anywhere in the nation. Supporters argued that tall buildings conserved land and reduced costs per unit. Planning documents from 1943 and 1944 emphasized efficiency. Architects believed modern construction could correct the failures of old tenements. They spoke about sunlight reaching upper floors. They spoke about fresh air and clean interiors. Concrete and steel were seen as durable and orderly. Design was expected to shape behavior. Critics raised concerns during this same period. Some architects and housing experts warned that large scale could create isolation. Social workers questioned how children would live far above street level. Others worried about supervision in long corridors and stairwells. These concerns appeared in professional discussions and internal memoranda, but wartime urgency pushed decisions forward. Speed carried more weight than caution. Site selection followed familiar lines already established before the war. Projects were placed near existing black neighborhoods on the south and west sides. This pattern reflected political reality. By 1944, housing officials understood that placing public housing in white neighborhoods would provoke resistance from local aldermen and residents. Opposition meetings and petitions had already shown this clearly. Officials rarely spoke about race in public statements. Instead, they used language of efficiency and land availability. Privately, concerns about stability and political backlash guided decisions. The outcome was clear. Public housing reinforced existing segregation patterns without explicitly naming them. One of the earliest large developments of this era illustrated both success and warning. The Ida B. Wells homes opened in 1941 on the south side. It replaced overcrowded and unsafe housing near the Black Belt. The apartments had indoor plumbing, reliable heat, and solid construction. For many families, this was the first time they had lived in housing built to modern standards. Early evaluations from 1941 through 1943 described the project as stable and well-maintained. Residents formed strong community ties. Children played in shared spaces. Management maintained buildings consistently. At this stage, the development worked as intended. It stood as proof that public housing could improve daily life. Yet demand far exceeded supply. By 1944, waiting lists for public housing in Chicago numbered in the thousands. Many families met income and residency requirements but remained unhoused. Wartime migration continued. Overcrowding persisted. The authority responded by planning larger developments, taller developments. The logic was repeated in planning meetings and reports. If one block could house hundreds, then several blocks could house thousands. This logic would guide Chicago's housing policy for years to come. When the war ended in 1945, the crisis did not fade, it intensified. Returning soldiers sought housing to start families. War workers wanted permanence. Temporary housing deteriorated or was dismantled. Slums still existed across the city. The shortage became a central urban issue. Federal policy shifted toward large-scale rebuilding. By 1946, national leaders promoted urban renewal as a solution. Cities were encouraged to clear areas labeled blighted and replace them with modern housing and infrastructure. Chicago embraced this approach with confidence, believing clearance would make room for progress. Clearance came first. Entire neighborhoods were marked for demolition in the late 1940s. Older housing stock was removed faster than replacement units could be built. Families were displaced with promises of future housing. Timing proved critical. Many waited months, some waited years. During that gap, hardship grew. Temporary moves became permanent losses. The Chicago Housing Authority moved quickly after the war. By the late 1940s, construction schedules shortened and designs standardized. Projects rose in clusters rather than as single buildings. This reduced costs and simplified approvals. Architects reused the same plans across sites. Long interior corridors stretched across each floor. Apartments were stacked floor upon floor. Shared indoor space was limited to stairwells, elevators, and narrow hallways. Outdoor space existed, but it was often undefined and poorly connected to daily routines. These design choices followed federal cost standards set by the United States Public Housing Administration. Budgets rewarded efficiency and repetition. Designs that reduced square footage per unit and per resident were favored. Chicago complied closely with these requirements. On paper, the buildings met all federal guidelines. In daily life, they often felt rigid and impersonal. Planners believed structure would create order. Clear lines, clean surfaces, predictable layouts. What they did not fully account for was how families actually lived. Children played where they could. Neighbors gathered in hallways when private space felt too small. The buildings had few areas meant for informal community life. This gap mattered over time. Rules inside public housing were stripped from the beginning. Tenants signed detailed lease agreements that governed behavior, visitors, noise, and cleanliness. These rules were standard practice by the late 1940s and were reinforced in the early 1950s. Inspections were frequent. Units were checked for condition and compliance. Management believed strict oversight would protect public investment and maintain safety. These rules created tension. Many residents understood the need for order. They also felt monitored. Authority figures appeared often. Warnings were written. Violations carried consequences. The housing authority felt pressure to enforce rules consistently, fearing criticism from city leaders and the public. Trust between residents and management weakened as enforcement replaced conversation. Still, many families valued their new homes deeply. For people who had lived in overcrowded and unsafe housing, these apartments offered stability. Running water meant health. Reliable heat meant safety in winter. Private kitchens allowed families to eat together. Children had bedrooms. Parents had doors that closed. Compared to what came before, this was real progress, and residents knew it. Yet, beneath the surface, problems began to grow quietly. Federal income rules required tenants to leave once their earnings rose above set limits. This policy existed nationwide and was enforced strictly in Chicago by the early 1950s. Families who found better jobs had to move out. Those who remained were poorer on average. Over time, this shifted the economic balance inside projects. Rent revenue declined. Maintenance funds grew tighter. Buildings experienced heavier use without matching resources. Wear increased faster than planners expected. Elevators carried hundreds daily. Plumbing systems strained. Trash systems broke down more often. These buildings were still young, yet they aged quickly under pressure. Maintenance backlogs grew year by year. At the same time, segregation deepened. Public housing in Chicago became closely linked to race during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Most large projects housed black families almost entirely. This was not required by federal law. National policy discouraged explicit segregation. Local practice shaped outcomes. Site selection and tenant assignment followed existing racial patterns. These decisions narrowed opportunity and concentrated poverty in specific areas. Public housing also became a political battleground. Aldermen fought over project locations throughout the 1950s. Neighborhood groups protested proposed sites. Public hearings grew heated. Lawsuits challenged placement and segregation. Each delay increased costs. The housing authority faced pressure from all sides. To keep projects moving, leaders often chose speed over broad debate. A major turning point came with the decision to build massive high-rise complexes on the South Side during the mid-1950s. These plans promised efficiency on an unprecedented scale. Hundreds of units were placed in single structures. Thousands were concentrated across large sites. City officials believed scale would finally overcome shortages. Numbers became the measure of success. Construction moved ahead. At the time, optimism remained strong. Architects spoke of modern living. Officials spoke of order and dignity. Reports predicted stable communities. Few predicted what daily life would feel like in buildings so large.
As these towers rose, the city crossed a line. Public housing stopped being a supplement. It became a defining feature of entire neighborhoods. Schools, transit, and services adjusted around it. The stakes increased. Residents entered buildings that changed how neighbors met. Hallways stretched long. Elevators became lifelines. Outdoor space shrank. Informal supervision weakened. These effects were not yet fully understood. At first, many residents felt pride in their new homes. By 1941 and 1942, when the Ida B. Wells homes and other early projects opened, families moved from overcrowded, unsafe tenements into clean apartments built with concrete and steel. They had private bathrooms for the first time. Heat worked reliably during winter. Children had separate rooms to sleep. Parents had doors that locked and windows that opened properly. These details mattered deeply. For families who had previously shared single rooms with multiple relatives or who had lived in buildings without heat, working plumbing, or safe stairs, this was not a small change. It was a tangible improvement in daily life. Residents noticed and celebrated it. Community formed quickly within these projects. Neighbors watched each other's children as parents worked long hours in factories. Women shared food, childcare tips, and household advice. Hallways echoed with conversation. In the earliest years of the 1940s, many projects remained calm. Maintenance staff worked consistently, elevators ran smoothly, and building supervisors knew residents by name. Public housing, at this point, still carried a sense of dignity and respect. For many, it represented security and progress. Yet the physical design of high-rises began to shape life in ways planners did not anticipate. Elevators had to run continuously to serve dozens of floors. Trash chutes and corridors had to function without clogging or flooding. Lighting needed constant maintenance. When one part failed, the whole system felt disrupted. A broken elevator or a burned-out light bulb caused small but persistent disruptions. These were not emergencies, they were daily strains that slowly wore residents down. Children often played in hallways when outdoor space was unavailable or unsafe. Outdoor playgrounds were limited and often shared by multiple buildings. Parents worried constantly about their children's safety. Carrying groceries up 4, 6, or 10 flights became a routine challenge. In early reports from the 1940s and 1950s, Chicago Housing Authority inspectors noted that residents frequently adapted to these inconveniences, but the strain was real and continuous. Income rules quietly reshaped the population inside the projects. Federal and local regulations required families whose earnings rose above specified limits to leave. Many families who had secured stable factory jobs, professional work, or military benefits had to vacate their apartments. Those who remained often had fewer resources, lower wages, and less social capital. Over time, this policy concentrated poverty. By the early 1950s, some of Chicago's largest projects, including the Cabrini Green and Stateway Gardens sites, housed almost exclusively low-income families. This shift was not intended to harm residents. It was a consequence of rules designed to provide opportunity to the neediest while cycling higher-earning families out. Maintenance budgets failed to keep pace with growing wear. Federal funds allocated in the late 1940s and early 1950s were sufficient for construction but inadequate for long-term upkeep. Repairs slowed. Broken fixtures, peeling paint, and non-functional elevators became common. Resident complaints often went unanswered for weeks or months. Trust between residents and the authority weakened as small problems persisted, compounding the daily strain. Rules inside the buildings became harder to enforce over time. By the mid-1950s, staff shortages meant management could not inspect units regularly. Tenants felt watched but not supported. Notices replaced dialogue, and discipline often replaced conversation. Residents learned that enforcement was uneven. Hallways that once echoed with neighborly conversation began to feel monitored and impersonal. The distance between authority and residents widened, setting the stage for frustration in the years to come.
This period illustrates an important reality. The early promise of public housing depended not only on good design, but also on consistent support, engagement, and resources. Without them, even well-intentioned systems began to strain under everyday life, slowly shaping communities in ways that federal planners could not have fully foreseen. Children felt this shift early. Schools near large projects grew crowded. Teachers faced classrooms full of students carrying stress from home. Quiet study space was rare. Noise traveled easily through concrete walls. Learning suffered without clear cause. The physical design also changed how adults interacted. Long corridors reduced casual contact. Stairwells felt unsafe at night. Shared spaces lacked clear ownership. When something broke, no one felt responsible. This sense of no ownership mattered more than planners realized. Segregation sharpened these effects. Most large projects housed Black families almost entirely. Jobs moved away from nearby areas. Transit linked residents to work, but travel took time and money. Isolation increased without being named. The city still believed in the system. Reports focused on unit counts and occupancy rates. On paper, goals were met. Slums had been cleared. Housing stood in their place. The deeper story lived inside apartments and hallways. Tension rose as younger residents reached their teens. Crowded schools and limited opportunity shaped choices. Police presence increased around projects. This presence brought safety for some and fear for others. Relationships between residents and authorities strained further. Families adapted. Grandmothers watched children. Neighbors shared resources. Informal rules developed. These acts kept many buildings functioning despite stress. This resilience deserves recognition. It kept daily life moving forward. Still, the scale of the buildings made personal solutions hard to sustain. When one family struggled, many felt it. Noise traveled, conflict spread. A single broken elevator affected hundreds. Small problems felt large. Public perception began to shift. Newspapers wrote about crime without context. Projects gained reputations. Residents felt judged by address alone. This stigma mattered. It shaped how employers viewed applicants. It shaped how schools treated students. The Chicago Housing Authority responded with stricter controls. Curfews were discussed. Guest rules tightened. These actions aimed to restore order. They also reduced trust. Residents felt punished for problems they did not cause. By the early years of this phase, a quiet truth had emerged. Public housing had solved one problem while creating others. It replaced unsafe homes with strong buildings. It also concentrated poverty and limited exit paths. This dual reality defined life inside the towers. By the time problems inside the towers became clear, decisions about public housing were no longer only about shelter. They were about power. They were about votes. They were about fear. This chapter explains how politics entered the story fully and how choices made in offices and council chambers shaped daily life inside the buildings. Chicago in the mid-20th century was a tightly controlled city. Political power flowed through ward offices, party leaders, and long-standing alliances. Housing was never separate from this system. Every new project raised questions. Where would it go? Who would live there? Who would oppose it? Each answer carried political weight. Aldermen played a central role. They guarded their wards closely. Many supported public housing in theory. Fewer supported it near their voters. Resistance grew strongest in white neighborhoods. Meetings turned tense. Petitions circulated. Protests formed. Leaders heard the message clearly: build elsewhere. This pattern repeated again and again. When planners proposed scattered housing across the city, political pressure pushed projects back toward areas already marked as poor and Black. These decisions were framed as practical. Land was cheaper. Opposition was weaker. The result was predictable. Concentration deepened. At the same time, federal policy rewarded scale. Larger projects promised lower costs per unit. Chicago leaned into this logic. Tower after tower rose. Officials spoke of efficiency and order. They measured success in numbers built, not in lives shaped. Public housing leadership changed over time. Each new head promised reform. Each faced the same limits. Funding depended on Washington. Local power depended on City Hall. Residents had little voice in either place. Their concerns traveled slowly upward, if at all. Public debate around housing shifted. Newspapers focused on incidents rather than causes. Headlines grew sharper. Public housing became shorthand for danger. This coverage influenced voters. It influenced officials. It hardened attitudes. Police presence increased around large projects. Leaders believed order would restore confidence. Patrols became common. Tension rose. Some residents felt safer, others felt targeted. Trust eroded further. The buildings began to feel watched rather than supported. Court cases added another layer. Lawsuits challenged segregation and site selection. Some rulings forced change on paper. Implementation moved slowly. Local resistance found new forms. Delays stretched on. Families waited. Meanwhile, maintenance suffered. Budgets failed to keep pace with need. Elevators broke more often. Heating systems aged. Repairs came late. These problems fed public criticism, which then justified tighter budgets. The cycle reinforced itself. Residents organized where they could. Tenant councils formed. Meetings were held. Complaints were written. Some leaders emerged from within the projects. They pushed for repairs, respect, and voice. Their work mattered, though victories were small. City leaders often viewed tenant activism with suspicion. They feared unrest. They feared loss of control. Dialogue remained limited. Decisions continued to flow downward. Urban renewal reshaped nearby areas. Expressways cut through neighborhoods. Businesses relocated. Jobs moved farther away. Public housing residents felt these changes sharply. Commutes grew longer. Costs rose. Opportunity narrowed. Schools tied to large projects struggled. Overcrowding increased. Resources thinned. Teachers worked under strain. Children carried the weight of instability. These effects were not part of housing plans, yet they followed directly from them. By this stage, public housing had become a symbol. For supporters, it represented commitment to the poor. For critics, it represented failure. Few spoke about how design and placement shaped outcomes. Fewer still spoke with residents themselves. Political leaders began to distance themselves. New projects slowed. Promises shifted. Public housing was no longer presented as a bold solution. It became a problem to manage rather than a vision to expand. In 1950, the United States Census recorded Chicago as a city of more than 3.6 million people. Public housing housed only a fraction of them, yet its influence stretched far beyond numbers. Large projects had become central features of entire neighborhoods. Their condition affected schools, transit, and public trust. Federal funding patterns shifted during the early 1950s. Housing funds competed with defense spending during the Cold War. Maintenance budgets did not grow with need. Buildings aged faster than planners expected. Concrete cracked. Plumbing strained. Elevators required constant repair. These were not sudden failures. They came slowly and predictably. By 1953, internal reports from housing authorities across the nation warned that high-rise public housing required more upkeep than low-rise designs. Chicago officials received similar warnings. They acknowledged them. They did not fully act on them. Cost remained the deciding factor. Tenant turnover increased during the mid-1950s. Families with rising income left, as rules required. Those who stayed had fewer resources. This shift reduced rent revenue. Less money flowed back into maintenance. The gap widened each year. In 1956, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act. Chicago soon felt its effects. Expressways cut through neighborhoods near public housing sites. Homes were demolished. Communities were divided. Access to nearby jobs weakened. Public housing residents experienced these changes without having shaped them.
Newspapers began using stronger language when describing public housing. Articles focused on disorder rather than design. Incidents were reported without context. Addresses became labels. Residents felt this shift deeply. Stigma followed children to school and adults to job interviews. The Chicago Housing Authority responded with stricter enforcement during the late 1950s. Inspections increased, rules tightened, evictions rose. These measures aimed to protect buildings. They also increased fear and resentment. The relationship between residents and management grew colder. In 1960, Chicago's population reached its peak. At the same time, signs of strain inside public housing became impossible to ignore. Elevators failed more often, trash systems broke down, lighting went unrepaired. Each problem added to daily stress. Federal housing policy continued to favor new construction over long-term upkeep. This imbalance mattered. By 1961, many projects were less than 20 years old, yet showed heavy wear. The design had assumed constant care. The funding did not match that assumption. Tenant councils grew more active during the early 1960s. Residents organized meetings, they wrote letters, they requested repairs and services. Some gained small victories, many felt unheard. Still, their efforts kept attention on conditions that official reports softened. Civil rights leaders in Chicago highlighted housing as a central issue. They pointed to segregation and concentration. Public housing stood at the center of these arguments. Court cases challenged discriminatory practices. Legal pressure increased, though change moved slowly. National unrest brought urban conditions under sharp scrutiny. Public housing became part of a larger debate about poverty and opportunity. Federal attention increased. Expectations rose. Funding did not keep pace. Maintenance backlogs were severe. Housing authority staff struggled to respond. Delays became routine. Residents adapted as best they could. They fixed what they could themselves. They relied on neighbors. These acts kept buildings functioning longer than budgets allowed. Public confidence continued to fall during the late 1960s. Politicians spoke less about expansion and more about control. Public housing was no longer presented as progress. It was discussed as a burden inherited from earlier decades.